So good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Clublia's Climate School, I welcome you all to tonight's conversation. It is entitled Unbottling the Environmental and Health Impacts of Nanoplastics. I know many of you are joining us remotely from around the city, the country, and the world, so please welcome to this event. My name is Jeffrey Shaman, and I am the Interim Dean of the Columbia Climate School and a professor in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. My own work focuses on infectious agents, including the effects of meteorological and hydrologic conditions on transmission processes for infectious agents such as the flu and COVID. However, tonight we're not going to be talking about my work. Tonight we're going to be looking at plastics and the potentially toxic effects on both our environment and human health. So we are talking about nanoplastics, and it's useful to know what they are. They are minuscule synthetic polymers formed when plastics break down into progressively smaller bits. The particles are being consumed by humans and other creatures in our ecosystems, and they have unknown potential health and ecosystem effects. Nanoplastics are difficult to detect compared with microplastics, and as a consequence, their effects have not been widely explored. So to talk about this problem, what we know and what we need to know, we have two leaders in their fields. First one I would like to introduce is Beijhan Yan. He is a Lamont Associate Research Professor of Environmental Geochemistry at Columbia's Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. Beijhan's research into nanoplastics holds immense promise, and his latest publication made headlines in January. That groundbreaking study conducted with colleagues at Lamont and the Department of Chemistry revealed the presence of hundreds of thousands of previously uncounted tiny plastic particles, nanoplastics, in bottled water samples. Particles had been uncounted because up until that breakthrough that was presented in the paper, it had been impossible to detect them and measure them. Additionally, we are joined by Julie Herbstman. Julie is a professor of environmental health science at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health, and she's director of the Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health. Julie's research, as it relates to plastics, traces the major exposure pathways that result from penetration through biological barriers and the potential health impacts of exposure and accumulation, including on developmental and neurological systems and effects. So welcome. I'd like to begin the discussion with our guests, and we will then take audience questions following that part of the program. Before we jump into nanoplastics, I would like to hear a little bit more from our guests about their backgrounds. So Julie, I'd like to begin with you. What drew you into environmental health studies generally and maternal and child health more specifically?
Hi, good evening, and thanks so much for having me on this panel. I've always been interested in the intersection of the environment and women's health, and unfortunately, both are pretty much underrepresented in research and also research funding. Maternal and child health are really interesting to me because pregnancy and early child development are uniquely vulnerable periods. Pregnancy puts a unique strain on a woman's body, and developing fetuses and young children don't detoxify chemicals very well due to their immature immune systems. So as we learned way back in the 60s with thalidomide, environmental exposures during these very sensitive periods can be really problematic and set the trajectory for the rest of life.
Thank you. Beijhan, turning to you, you have a large body of work studying environmental contaminants and waterways. What led you to start this work, and how did you wind up on this path to study plastics?
Thanks for having me. Yes, I conduct research on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and also the impact of hydraulic fracturing on air and water quality, especially in Pennsylvania. So I started paying attention to microplastic pollution about 7 years ago, mainly for two reasons. One is the extent of these global issues, So each year, there were about 400 million metric tons of plastic are produced. And though this number might not be, initially think it's significant, but it's actually exceeding the total weight of human beings, which is about 390 million tons. And also the second reason is also the outstanding pictures always showing the entanglement of fish nets to the turtles and also the various plastic items finding in the stomachs of the seabirds. So personally, I was also shocked by the findings of my colleagues. Joachim Goes, who's a professor here at the ocean, as a marine biologist, he showed me these photos he took from the South Korean Sea, demonstrating this attachment of the microbeads to the phytoplankton and zooplanktons. Additionally, Deborah McDinney, who is a high school teacher working with high school summer programs here at Lamont, and her students also found microplastics in each seafood samples that they are purchased from the local seafood stores. So because of that, I began my research on microplastics on New York City waterways through the collaborations with the Riverkeeper and John Lipscomb, who providing us with a free boat time to collecting the samples. And so with that support, we are able to publish the articles and apply for research funding from the Hudson River Foundation, etc. Yeah.
So Bejan, following up on that and on that study that you published with your colleagues in January, you found that the amount of nanoplastics in bottled water is much greater, perhaps 10 times greater than previously understood. Why did you focus on nanoplastics?
Yeah, I have 3 research areas. One is the environmental source and the behavior of pollutants, and then is characterizing exposure and link the exposure to the health outcomes. And the third one is developing the engineering solutions to mitigating exposure and health issues. So compared with microplastics, nanoparticles, which is plastic particles less than 1 microns, and are thought to be more toxicant. Because the smaller the particle size, it's easier for the particles to penetrate in the biological barriers. For example, the epithelial cells in the lung. And then they can get into the blood and then can be transported to the vital organs. So that's why this is was an urgent need if we try to study the exposure and also health outcomes. However, the smaller the particles is difficult more to measure, because I started to pay attention to the nanoparticles about 4 years ago. Unfortunately, there was no reliable method at the time. And typically, you can see there was a electron microscope that could possibly can identify particles, but you don't know what particle it is, because they are only let you know this is a carbon. And so there was also cannot differentiate it from this plastic to the other carbon-based particles. And the traditional Raman and also the infrared spectroscope method also cannot. They always can identify particles in more than 5 microns. So this is became the bottleneck in the whole field in microplastic and nanoplastics works. So actually, I was really want to do the exposure study. So then I tried to different method, and also I was looking into the various different of the literatures, and not only in my field but also in the physics chemistry field. And I found this potential techniques called stimulated Raman scattering. I found also this co-inventors, Professor Wiming, who is also a professor at Columbia Chemistry Department. So I then emailed him and then requested the collaborations, and he replied my email within just half an hour and said, let's talk. So starting that, we did collaborations with 2 groups, and we set up these platforms.
He was conveniently close, yes.
Exactly.
So the tools you and your team devised then enabled you to look closely at nanoplastics in water bottles. And that's what's really key here. Can you tell us about the technology and what it means to this type of study?
So the SRS basically is identify this type of the particles in each particles based on the Raman signals scattered from the particles under the laser radiation. Seems like very complicated. But the way it works is very similar to the operating principle of microwave that in your kitchen. So when you put food in the microwave and turn it on, the microwave emits these electromagnetic waves with a certain energy that specifically makes these water molecules in the food rotate or vibrating. This energy from the electron microwave being transferred to the food, to the water molecules in the food. That's why it's getting heated up. Similarly, in this SRS, the laser basically just function as the electromagnetic waves in your microwave. Instead of the cooking food, now this lasers waves exciting the chemical bonds in the molecules within the particles. So basically SRS actually using two lasers. And these two lasers, the difference in the energy, if they are the same as the energy needed for exciting the chemical bonds in the molecules, then these Raman signals was dramatically being increased, so they are being able to be, identify that. So basically this allowing detailed, visualizations and chemical analysis of the samples that at varies in like a particular polymer levels. So compared with traditional method, SRS is fast and sensitive because it's increased sensitivity about like 10,000 times. And because the insensitive increase, so now they can go to the nanoparticles in that levels. Yeah, this is basically opens to a new window for us to the invisible nanoplastic world.
Fantastic. So the results that you got when you applied the SRS techniques to it and looking at bottled water, did the results surprise you?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. So we did see a very high level of nanoparticles levels in the bottled water. For example, we see the 240,000. And so this is really about 100 times higher than the other report. But when we think about because the other report only doing the microplastic and we do the nanoplastic and the microplastic, so that's the reason we get the much higher level.
Mm-hmm.
And also we also find out that they are particles from the PET, which is polyethylene terephthalate. This particle is called PET. These particles, we saw that they are in the water samples. We actually not very surprised because we know the particle they can come out from the bottle materials because the bottle was made by the PET. So you're supposed to see that. However, we're also very surprised to see the other plastics there. For example, we see the polyamide, even high concentration polyamide, and also the polystyrene, also with PVC, etc. So this is a very surprise to us because the bottled water is supposed to have very clean because they are used advanced filtration techniques to remove the nanoparticles from the water. So why we actually see this different type of the plastic there? So that is actually that we actually starting to relook our data and we look back again and again, and we finally decided that yes, this is confirmed that those are actually the PVC and polyamide particles. So question is where they're coming from, right? So what we think about is the filtration techniques that are used for as the reverse osmosis used for the filtrations. They are remove the particles from the source water. However, they are also generating this filter material, the nanoparticles, to the bottled water. The reason is because this reverse osmosis filter, they're made by the PVC and the polyamide as well.
Interesting, fascinating. I'm gonna pivot now to Julie. Julie, in your work studying maternal and childhood health, how did this discovery about the volume of nanoplastics in such widely consumed product, bottled water, how did that reverberate?
So as an epidemiologist, my work focuses mainly in three areas. I want to know how women and children are women and children exposed to environmental pollutants? And if they are exposed, what does that do? And then the third aim for me is always to figure out, well, how is that happening? What is the chemicals like nanoplastics? What are they doing inside someone's body to cause some health effects? And so in terms of Bejan's work, the fact that there are nanoplastics in bottled water is probably not super surprising. What is amazing is the fact that he can measure them and characterize them so well. And by doing that, we can then trace them back to their sources, which helps us on the human side of things, help people figure out where exposures are coming from, which is really important.
Fantastic. And how important is Bejan's new technology to study nanoplastics for your studies? If you can't measure it, what are you going to do? Now that you can measure it, how important is that?
Yeah, so it's just mission critical, right? So their work with, if we can't measure, as you say, if we can't measure an exposure and we can't characterize it, then we can't begin to start understanding what it might or might not be doing to the health of all of us. And so my work relies on analytic chemists like Bejan, and so we work together. We have to work together, and this kind of interdisciplinary work is what is needed to be able to answer the kinds of questions that we all care about.
Fantastic. Bejan, do you see opportunities to collaborate with Julie and her focus on nanoplastics and its impact on the human condition? Is that an area that you're thinking about moving into?
Yes, actually, Julie and I are working together on a proposal to study the nanoparticle exposures in the pregnant woman. So she has this, longitudinal cohort, birth cohort and so what we try to do is to select like 120 pregnant women, and then we give them the samplers, like air samplers, and also we collected the urine and the feces samples so that we can measure what they are exposed during their pregnant time. And then we actually identify and also, like the microplastic nanoparticles in the placenta after delivery, and then try to link their, exposure to the, gene expression changes basically identified by or determined by the RNA sequence in placenta and also the other outcomes. So in addition, we're also collaborating with Phoebe Stapleton from Rutgers University, because she's expert to using the rat model to study the mechanisms of and the impact of on development using the animal model. Her previous work was found actually interesting that nanoparticles can cross the placenta in just 20 minutes after exposure. She actually used the rat model, and would be also being studied in this proposed work.
Well, that's very concerning. I mean, you can see that there are multiple potential pathways for exposure and ways of measuring this as well between the air and the water and whatnot.
Yeah.
Julie, are there likely pathways by which nanoplastics can get into the body? Bejan just talked about it crossing the placental barrier, but what do we know about how for non-fetal organisms, let's say, and what do we still need to know along the way?
So I think we're starting to understand that we're exposed to nanoplastics most commonly through the air that we breathe when the particles end up in the air, or in the food we eat, and then maybe a little bit more surprisingly through the things that we put on our bodies, like personal care products, lotions, cosmetics. And so in terms of developing babies, as Bejan described, Phoebe's work in rats showed that the nanoplastics that the rats are exposed to, and we know exactly how much the rats are exposed to because they're dosed, right? They're in a laboratory setting. So the rats are given a specific amount of nanoplastics, and those run right through the placenta. And so not surprisingly, for an observational study like the kind that I do, we're not going to give people, we're not going to dose people with nanoplastics, right? So what we need to do is use the technology that Bejan and Wei described to try to figure out how much how much are people getting exposed to and how much is actually in the placenta, because we realize that the placenta is not doing a very good job at protecting a developing baby from being exposed, similar to what's happening in the rat. So given that we're all exposed, we now need to do the kinds of studies using his technology to figure out, well, what is it doing? And that's our next move.
Well, how would you go about gauging that impact and, let's say, the level of concern on maternal health in particular?
Well, I'd say that it's pretty concerning, but in reality, we're all exposed to lots of things all of the time, and some of them, and not all of them, are bad, right? So some of the chemicals we take in, like medicines, we do that intentionally, and other exposures are unintentional, like chemicals in our environment. But what's concerning about plastics is the size of the particles, like Bejan mentioned before. They're so small, so they can reach deep in our tissues. And so they themselves may be toxic. So we know that one kind of microplastic is polystyrene, which is a carcinogen. But the other issue is that they're also mixed with, or sometimes they carry other chemicals with them as they pass through. So a lot of my work focuses on endocrine disrupting chemicals like phthalates or bisphenol A or BPA, as you probably have heard of it, that are plastic additives or flame retardants, metals that travel along with the nanoplastics. And so we've shown in other research over and over again, unrelated to nanoplastics, that these kind of chemicals are really problematic for child development.
Wow, a lot to unpack there, very much so. But I guess it begs a question for you, Bejan, which is, what is the makeup of these nanoplastics? You talked about how the reverse osmosis process may be clearing some things out, but adding some things in. What is the variety that you see there, and are some more harmful or toxic than others?
Yeah, so the plastic was first invented in 1907, and many plastics type was invented 50 years after that. So because they are using a different molecular structures leading to their physical and chemical characteristics are so different. And because of this diversity and also inexpensive, so the industry love it. So that's why you can see the growth of the particles being produced was exponentially increased. So in addition to there are polymer bases, as you know, different of the plastics. So nanoparticles being also contains these additives used in manufacturing or original plastic products. For example, they are used plasticizers, stabilizers, flame retardant, and pigment. These, additives can influence the physical and the chemical properties.
Mm-hmm.
So the toxicant was really depending on the composition, the size, additives added, and the shape. And the nanoparticles has its own problem. Is that nanoparticles are relatively, first is easier to get across the barrier. Second thing is also nanoparticles has relatively more chemicals close to the edge, especially for additives. The reason I'm saying, if you think about it, you have 200 nanometers of the particles. And now all your additives you add in was within 100 nanometers to the edge. So that is a very small distance for the additive to migrating. The reason is the additives being able to migrate is because the additive was just added into this polymer matrix. So they're not using any chemical bonds there. So they're basically freely like floating inside of these plastics. And so that's why when you have so close to the edge, then you have more easier for this, like chemicals being, leached out. So, and also different chemicals has been, different plastic have different, like additives. For example, PVC often contains, like a solid, which is, like Julie mentioned that. And so, and also solid as endocrine disruptors have been linked to the range of the reproductive and development issues. Mm-hmm. So the polystyrene is commonly found in also, like in the disposable food containers and the cups and packing materials. So, and they can leach out the styrene, as Julie mentioned. This is the styrene is a human carcinogen. So there were different type of the plastic can have a different of the toxicant. Yeah.
That's a lot to categorize. I mean, that is a huge variety that you just touched on. I imagine there are many more that you haven't thought about. I mean, Julie, for you and your work, do you find certain plastics to be of greater concern than others?
Well, so as I mentioned before, I spend a lot of time studying endocrine disruptors. And so this is a group of chemicals, and they're important to study because they interfere with normal signaling and communication within our bodies that we need to function optimally. And so the endocrine system is quite tightly regulated, and it's involved in everything. So if you think about thyroid hormones, and it's involved in metabolism or reproduction, you could think about estrogens or androgens like testosterone. So in a developing fetus or a child, this signaling is involved in all sorts of developmental processes, from how tall a kid will grow to how well their brains will develop and function. And so when our bodies confuse these chemicals with our internal hormones, because they look similar, all of these feedback loops are disrupted. And I think a great example of this is BPA. And so I talked about this a bit earlier, but historically it became popular when scientists were looking for a synthetic estrogen to treat things like menopausal symptoms or pregnancy-related nausea and to prevent miscarriages. And so BPA was considered because it was estrogenic, but it wasn't quite strong enough. So instead, they turned to another estrogenic compound called diethylstilbestrol, or DES, which we now know is a potent carcinogen. So, but instead of like getting rid of BPA and putting it on the shelf, chemists found that it was useful for making other things like epoxy resins, things that line cans, bottle tops, adhesives, and for making very hard polycarbonate plastic. So these things have many uses, right? And so, and not related at all to the fact that BPA is estrogenic. But the critically important thing now is that we're all exposed to all of these hormone-like properties of this synthetic estrogen from so many different sources. So every baby born in the US today has some amount of BPA in them, which to me is totally scary.
Yeah, that is very frightening. All right. Bejan, now that you and your colleagues have developed a way to more closely discern the scope of the problem, the abundance of this in water and air, and what's coming out of human bodies and what may even be in tissue, are there efforts to stem the flow of nanoplastics, to stop them at the source or to prevent them from getting into our systems, our bodies, our waterways? What technologies are available now in that regard?
So yeah, as Julie mentioned, nanoparticles are ubiquitous. They are in the air we breathe, and in the water we drink, and in the food we eat. That's really, your question is really critical, is how we can reduce these nanoparticle levels in all these sources. So after we published these bottled water studies, I was invited to presenting my work at the annual conference at the UK's Bottled Water Association. In that talk, I suggest the collaboration with the industry, so we can really helping them. And especially, we want to see, which industry process really leading to the nanoplastics, and could we using a different alternative way to replace that, filtration process that could helping us to, remove the nanoparticles. So I'm waiting for their responses for that. So we also measure the nanoparticles in tap water collected from the multiple US citizens, because we always get the questions from the audience and from the media that is this nanoparticle, is that the tap water is safer to drink or whatever, something like that. So so we actually starting to collecting the samples. We already collected like about 20, samples from the United States, including Boston's, Chicago's, and Los Angeles, etc. So right now, based on our research, for some samples we collected from tap water, we did see the nanoparticles in this tap water as well. So to reduce this exposure from this source, then my group is right now developing these separation techniques that can remove the nanoparticle from the both bottled water or drinking water. So this is still under the development. So however, when we showing this, suggesting the technologies, we have to be a little bit careful. The reason is that we need double check whether they can introduce the other pollutants when you're using these new technologies. For example, as we mentioned, this bottled water have been developed to remove the microbes and the virus, and from the source water, so supposed to be very clean. However, that this reverse osmosis may also contribute in nanoparticles to the bottled water. So therefore, when we try developing this new method, and when we evaluating this method, we have to be sure that that procedures would not including any other new material or new pollutants.
It's almost sort of like a first do no harm approach, which you would get in medicine. What are you working towards, or what is the goal here, would you say?
What I'm seeing, what we are doing is try to cutting down the exposure from different sources. Yeah. For example, as I mentioned, we are developing this separation technique to remove nanoparticles from water, but we will check the new technology doesn't leading to the other contaminations, for example, lead, etc., or other organics that we don't want to be putting there as well. So we are also developing the method that could not only from the bottled water or from the tap water, but also we're developing the method that to preventing the leakage of microfibers and nanoparticles from the laundry sources. This is, of course, a different project. And so the reason is because in the ocean, there was about 35% of microplastic pollution was originated from the laundry sources. And this number in the New York City waterways was higher. And I'm pretty sure in the other waterways, urban waterways will also be higher. So then, with the supporting from NOAA sea grants, we are developing these advanced filtration techniques that can remove microfibers. And then, after this design, right now it's in the prototype, a phase. After that, we're going to use that and miniaturize it so that we can design a way to incorporate it into the power and the water supplies of washing machine or dryers. Because we think that, if we can be able to solve this problem, then the air we breathe in will have much less of the microfibers and nanoplastics in the air that we breathe.
Fascinating. Laundry is a big source, the clothes industry, indeed. Do you think that the techniques that you're using can emerging technologies such as AI be used and leveraged in what you're doing?
Yeah, we actually using the AI in our researches. And so for example, when, when the particles became smaller, then the Raman signals gets weaker, even you have the increase in sensitivities, but the background was also increased. So in order to really identify these particles, and so we actually use the machine learning techniques to training the peak identifications and help establish the algorithms, so that after that, like new technologies, and right now the success rate for identifying nanoparticles was dramatically increased, which lead to much less of the misclassifications. So another AI usage right now we are considering putting on is this called the plastic collectors that from the rivers, from the coastal areas. And for example, river and coastal input is about like 80% of plastic on the oceans. However, the existing water-based plastic waste collectors face challenges in discriminating between plastic and also not other naturally degradable debris, for example, the leaves, branches, and also dead fish, something like that, right? So this lack of the selectivity, which leading to the frequent clogging and the rapid fill up. And this is costing the increased cost for the maintenance and waste, sorting later. So there was one groups that actually use these technologies and think that our new technology, if we can identify the plastics using the AI, then can reduce their, the percentage, reduce their labor or, operation cost by 60%, which is more sustainable. So recently we actually submitted the proposal to NOAA for developing this AI-assisted plastic waste real-time monitoring and also collection systems. The device will harness, intelligent recognition techniques, and then can accurately differentiate natural debris from the plastics and other key resource items, for example, the metal soda cans. So that this proposal, can with that one, with the identification of the plastic, then we only collected the plastics rather and let the other natural debris fly through. So this proposal already gets strong support from the major cleanup players in the world, such as Ocean Cleanup. They are really, interested in collaborating with us if we get this AI, assist systems.
Fantastic. Julie, last month, the New England Journal of Medicine published a report that found microplastics and nanoplastics are emerging as a potential risk factor for cardiovascular disease. This comes from preclinical studies. From your vantage, what are the most urgent scientific questions really for this issue?
So yeah, this was a really interesting study. So this is a study in a bunch of people who had coronary artery disease and had plaque removed from the carotid arteries. And so what they did was in that plaque, they tried to see if they could find or detect any measurable amounts of micro and nanoplastics. And so they measured both polyethylene and polyvinyl chloride. And they found that the people who had more polyethylene and polyvinyl chloride in their plaque were more likely to have a stroke, a heart attack, or actually to die within 3 years of having that procedure done. And so they also found that the people who had detectable levels of plaque had more biomarkers of inflammation. And so this is a super interesting first study really showing us what we should be looking for. It doesn't prove causality, right? It doesn't say that the nanoplastics in the plaque are causing someone to have a stroke, but it's giving us a signal that this is something that we should be looking into a little bit more and trying to figure out what these plastics might be doing. So that's in a group of people who already have cardiovascular disease. We know very, very little about what these kinds of exposures are doing to pregnant women or children. And so all we can do is take cues and try to learn from what's happening with, this specific group of adults, and also from what we've seen in these animal studies that show that there are immunotoxic effects and behavioral changes among animals that are, considerably exposed to these kind of particles.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating and frightening a bit. Bejan, how far are we from figuring out how pervasive and how toxic nanoplastics are to our planet and to our health?
Yeah, I think there's still a long way to go. we just developed this analytical approach and as a platform and use bottled water as a case studies. We know they are pervasive because we also collecting samples from the snow, from the polar regions, but and also from the lakes, from the oceans, but their distribution and levels in the very environments are still largely unknown. In addition, how they're getting into across the biological barrier and their toxicity and what's the health impact are largely undetermined. So when we plan to use this platform, so that's the reason we really want to use this platform for measuring nanoparticles in the air, in the water, in the biological samples, so we can get much better knowledge about that.
Yeah. So I have a question really for both of you. I'll start with you, Julie. What areas would you study if there were more investment in this area?
Yeah, so I feel like maybe a little bit of a broken record here, but we know that everybody's exposed, but we don't yet know exactly how much everyone is exposed to, what causes some people to be more exposed than other people, and what health effects we could expect to see among people who have exposures. And so, and this is really important, again, sorry to be a broken record on this, but among kids, pregnant women who are especially susceptible when they have unique periods of susceptibility, we really know almost nothing about the health effects that might be due to plastics, and so from the nanoplastics. But we have a good sense of the potential based on the animal models that have been done and the other studies that we've been done looking at the components of plastics like BPA and phthalates and flame retardants and all of these other things. So we're starting to get an understanding, but it's not until we can incorporate the technology that Bejan described that we really have the opportunity to do the kinds of studies that we'd like to be doing to understand this in a more holistic way.
So Bejan, how about you? What would you want to study and where would you like to see investment?
I really want to study the exposure, like for the regular people, what their major pathways, for example, are they from the air or from the, like food or from drinks, etc. Also, we want to also focus on the impact on the sensitive populations because, like think about it, when the people getting older, they are blood-brain barrier, they have this, the conjunctions, these junctions getting loose when the people getting older. Which is leading to the easier crossing of nanoparticles to the brain. And so a recent study have shown that exposure to nanoparticles leading to the Alzheimer's. And so, but more studies are needed for nanoparticles impact on this neurodegeneration disease, etc.
Right. In terms of your research, Bejan, are there bottlenecks right now?
That after this particle was published, we got many requests for collaborations from the Harvard, from MIT, from Stanford, etc. So the current bottleneck is not really lacking all these samples or biological samples to do the analysis or environmental samples or good research design, but the instruments and also the, we can use and also the student and postdoc to run those samples. We really needed more resource for that. Yeah.
So in addition to trying to pull away the exposure, part of that, you talked about removing nanoplastics and plastics from the environment, but is there a pathway also for finding a viable replacement, an alternative to plastics even?
Yeah, so the part of answer is actually to replace the plastic with other materials. For example, you could, you may cut down the nanoparticle exposure from drinking water from the bottled water by replacing the bottled water with another type of the, bottles. And also the paper bag was another good example, replacing the single-use plastic bags that the ban of the single plastic bags in the New York City and New York State as well. And also, that, like New York City in 2019, they also banned the styrofoam. Yeah. And so the paper form right now is actually used to replace that. So this certainly is like a good, certain way you can do the viable replacement. Yeah. However, that the main purpose of this, is to reduce the plastic pollution issues. So we can follow the 4 R's. This, reduce, reuse, recycle, and recover. So complete replacement of plastic was at this moment was not really feasible. For example, 40% of the car weight is actually plastics, of course, except the Cybertruck. So plus we also consider the source of the, like that replacement, is that from the the wood or from the like the bamboo or from metals. So they are unlimited. So we really need to figure out that. So they are even that doesn't have any single and universally viable replacement for plastics that match all these applications for the plastics.
Yeah. Well, what can individuals do to protect the environment and protect themselves? I mean, talk about curtail single-use plastics, how effective they are. Is that an effective response? Is that just part of the problem is what I'm hearing from you, right?
Yes, yes. So individual involvement is very key to ending these plastic pollutions. As individuals, you need to probably follow the waste management instruction carefully. For example, in the Rockland County where I live, there was 2 recycle bins. One is for paper, one is for glass, plastic, and metals. And so it's critical that the individual follow this instruction to that waste can be recycled appropriately. So the secondly, individual can certainly reduce the use of single-use plastic containers, and then they bring these plastic films or styrofoam to the to the stores that can be recycled. For example, not in the New York, but in the New Jersey, there was some communities have this called the styrofoam densifiers. So they basically bring these dense plastics into this one goes to densifiers, and then that's has been used and which is efficient to that. So for the third is we need to advocating for the new plastic policies. For example, if we see these filters that have been developed in my lab can be removed, like microfibers from the washing machines waste, then we need your help to really advocating that, to talk with the, like Congress and talk to the senator, etc., to helping passing the law for that. Yeah.
So we've got to get to audience questions in a moment. Julie, just tell me though briefly, what are some practical ways households can cut down on their exposure to nanoplastics? What was your perspective on that?
I totally agree with what Bejan said. I think there are things we can do to try to limit our use of single-use plastics, which might mean bringing reusable silverware to school or to work, or using a refillable water bottle instead of buying water. But really important is to support the kind of policies that have much broader effects. So as Bejan mentioned, both New York, New Jersey have policies that ban supermarkets from providing single-use plastic bags. Restaurants aren't going to give you a straw unless you asked for one. These are really important because they have much broader impact than anything one individual can do on their own. So I would reiterate supporting those kinds of policies.
And just for both of you, is there any other key take home before we move to the audience questions? What's the thing you'd want everyone to know? Bejan, how about you first?
So yeah, plastic pollution is ubiquitous and we're getting worse if it's business as usual. And hopefully strong support for more study will helping us better characterizing the exposure and health outcomes. And with the increased public awareness and also implementation this national and international regulation. For example, right now there are UNEPs pushing for this plastic treaty. If they're passed, then they can certainly helping to solve these global issues. I expecting probably with technology development, this global plastic pollution issue may be constrained within probably like next 30 years, something like that.
30 years. Wow. Yeah. Julie, how about you?
Yeah, so I agree with Bejan. I guess I would also say that I think there are a lot of people who don't realize that unlike drugs or vaccines, which take a while and are tested before they end up in the public spaces, lots of chemicals that are used in the production of plastics aren't tested before they're put into products. And so in terms of our health, we don't really know what's happening until after they're already in use. So in some ways, we're all guinea pigs out here in the world, and we need the kinds of studies to understand what's happening. Unfortunately, rather than doing that before all these chemicals are out in the world, we're doing it after the fact, and that's really unfortunate. And I would hope that studies in sensitive populations like women and children, I keep talking about, will be prioritized because they really are the ones that are most likely to see effects. But I also want to mention that plastics are made from fossil fuels, right? So as we move away from oil and gas to address climate change, the oil and gas, they're going to put their products somewhere. And so oil and gas and plastic industries are completely tied together. And so as we try to mitigate climate change, we also need to understand that reducing our dependence on plastics is part of that story. And I think that connection is not always so clear.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for pointing that out. So we're going to turn to some audience questions. I have them being sent to me. There are quite a number, so we're not going to be able to get to everyone's. Here's a simple one from Guy Jacob. What is the best filter to install in the home under the kitchen sink? Do you guys have the ability to answer that? Or is that, I'm going to look at you, Bejan. You let me know if you know.
I think that right now we are still, I think that currently, we are developing this new technology so that can remove the nanoparticles from the from the tap water, etc. So still under development. The reason is, we tried the other, method that are used for filtrations, but we also see the particles being shed from these filters as well. So we really need to working, that's what I mentioned before, we really need to double check with everything so that we're not, while we are using the filters that are being designed in the, in the market, they are really contributing to some other pollutants. So that's we have to be very careful on that.
Sounds like a very difficult problem that you can't give an answer yet. And everything that we use is so plastic rich that we're just shedding, even when we're filtering. Oh boy.
Exactly.
So here's another one. It says, have you evaluated drinking water, tap water, and have you evaluated groundwater, since there are many families in the US that use wells for their source of drinking water? Have you looked at groundwater, well water?
So we haven't used the groundwater yet, but so when we think about the groundwater, because this aquifer, which is the sand, layers, that typically can become a filter. So potentially most of the microfibers or microplastics can be filtered out by the, like these aquifers. However, nanoparticles, how they are, whether they can go passing through this, like a pore size on the sand in the aquifers, this is still open questions. So we haven't done the research on that, but this could be interesting topics for us to do in the future as well. Thanks for the question. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So another one that may be for both of you, John Libretti asked, do plastic alternatives, I'm not quite sure what that would be, also contribute to the risks described, or have you found that that area is under-researched? Maybe with risks, Julie, is that some area where you can think of, other plastic alternatives or chemicals that are out there? I know you study a wealth of them.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that I can identify what is a plastic alternative. I mean, certainly like a metal bottle, like a metal bottle is a plastic alternative, and it doesn't have the same sort of risks that we're concerned about. But I have a sense that that's maybe not exactly the question that the is being asked. And so maybe Bejan, I don't know if you have a better sense of what plastic.
Yeah, they probably have this plastic that we call biopolymers, which is bioplastic, which is they are probably biodegradable. The plastics they are used in the world. So there was some studies showing that like these biodegradable ones can also get into small piece, getting into nanoparticles easily, and that could also lead into some of the intestine, like inflammation, etc. So there was more study was still working on that. So yeah, so more as I mentioned, we are really try to working hard to get those things being, like analysis. Yeah.
So we have another anonymous question which asks about regulations. Can you speak to any tightening regulations being placed on plastic manufacturing, given the potential health risks identified from these emerging studies, or is it too early at this point? And are there analogs from other more well-studied chemicals?
Yeah, so there are, like we know there are in the state and also in the government levels, we see there are, like a method for banning these plastics as well. For the industries, when there was a ban on that, then they are starting to really reduce the, like the amount per products on that. So in terms of the other things, I'm not really quite sure. Yeah.
Julie, yeah.
I would just add that I'm not sure that any regulation is being done for the sake of health effects yet, because we haven't really demonstrated those not in humans anyhow. So I think there's a lot that's being done because we recognize that plastic pollution is bad. But I'm not sure that there's regulation aimed at being health protective. I don't know that that's occurring yet. I'm sure there's conversations.
So do you, but Julie, go ahead, Bejan, I'm sorry.
But I think that so I know that Congress has a hearing about like 2 months ago. They're like really focused on the nanoplastics and microplastics in the drinking waters. So with this, when the Congress was interested in that, so they are potentially will passing through some laws in the future to really targeting for the nanoparticles or microplastics. So we'll hope that in the future we can have some of the law to be implemented on that.
And similarly, Julie, you work on other exposures as well, some of which has led to health motivated regulation, right?
Yeah. So there are. I think that the challenge though is that, because of the way our regulatory policies work, we end up oftentimes replacing whatever we take away with something else that hasn't been tested yet. So we end up in a cycle. Sometimes we talk about it as regrettable substitutions because we end up in the same place now studying the next thing. And again, I return to BPA. We've gotten BPA out of a lot of plastic water bottles, but now we're studying BPS and BPF and the things that replaced BPA. So we end up in a story where we're just moving incrementally down the line, which isn't necessarily very effective.
I guess the question is then how do we break that cycle, right? And that's a hard question. I don't think I should put you on the spot on that one right now. All right.
We can think about things as a group, right? Like instead of getting one thing at a time, we can think about classes that can be taken away instead of chemicals that are similar. We can regulate them as a bunch, as opposed to doing it one by one by one.
So it becomes an exposure, an exposomic, if you will, advantage. But we have like 100,000 unregulated chemicals and who knows what coming into our environment. There's a major change in mindset. Is it even feasible to do all the necessary health studies? Do we have the technologies to do that yet before they're put into our products?
I mean, could it be done? Yeah, I think it could be done. I think a European model is very, very different, where there's testing before things end up out in the world. That's just not the way our system works, unfortunately. So it would be a systemic change in order for that to occur, and more of a precautionary approach as opposed to let's wait till it's out there and then see what happens.
Probably some model can also predict the toxicity based on the molecular structures. I think some of the company also use that for predicting the toxicities, rather than goes to the very expensive rat and also the animal testings as well.
So there is some preventative methods that could be employed, and in some instances are. That's what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we have a question here from Stephanie, which says, can our bodies get rid of the nanoplastics? And if so, how?
So that's a very good question. So when the particles getting into the blood and then transport to the vital organs, they have probably 2 ways. One is from the filter, from the kidney. And the kidney has, because it's filter organs, so they are, nanoparticles more than 7 nanometers. If it's normal functions, they are actually being stopped. So basically keeping inside of the blood. So another one is from bios. So that's the 2 ways that actually we think about potentially can get rid of the plastic. But then it's also hard if they are getting the tissues, it's also very hard for them to come out from the tissue and get in the blood and then get to the kidney again. So this is still like a study question that we are doing. Yeah.
I think it's a question that can be answered almost best with an animal study, where exactly what you're putting in, and then you can measure exactly what's coming out. In people, because we don't actually know what's getting in, it's very hard for us to figure out, what's coming out based on, we don't have that equation set up.
Exactly. We have if we have well-controlled experiments, that we certainly can figure out the influx and also the efflux of that. Yeah.
So we're getting lots of questions about whether or not, which is worse, tap water or bottled water? Can you answer that yet, Beijing?
I get the questions when I take the other media interviews, and I could not answer that question. The reason is that bottled water has its own advantages, because they remove the bacteria from the virus and from different particles that can potentially causing the health outcomes. So of course they are can loading into the, like nanoparticles, but they also remove the other things. And this tap water really depends on the, you are, like where the source from. So that is, some of them may have contains high, metal, high heavy metal levels or other like PFAS, etc. So there was, this is question still need to be answered and still need to be studied as well. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So that's really all the time we have this evening. I want to thank Bejan and Julie for joining us for this discussion and their fascinating perspectives. I also want to thank all of you for being here. Tonight's Earth Series discussion underscores the important work of the Columbia Climate School and its approach to transdisciplinary research to solve humanity's most pressing issues. I think it also speaks to the urgency of our work and its powerful promise to create concrete action. To respond to the escalating crises that we see now and to generate creative solutions, we need deep collaboration, transdisciplinary teams that include individuals from research, communities, businesses, and cities that are facing the impacts of climate change and other environmental sustainability issues. In order to do that, we need schools that are like ours that are developed with a mission to really address that. So I urge you to follow us on social media and to sign up for our newsletters to learn more about all of the urgent research developments at the Climate School. And I also would ask you to consider supporting our work with a gift. Thanks again for joining us and have a great evening. Take care.